BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. Last week, Sarah Jamal woke up to silence. No traffic in the street, no hum from the fridge. It was the third day in a row without power. She'd have to throw away more food, and there'd be no running water again. But it's her neighbour she's most worried about. She has a 5-year-old son. He's diabetic. His mother and Sarah spent the whole day searching for a generator and a fridge to store his insulin. These are the everyday challenges of life in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. Once a busy metropolis, now a ghost town, the near silence punctuated by this. Airstrikes from Saudi planes, targeting Houthi rebels who now control much of the country. The president, Mr. Hadi, called on Saudi Arabia for help after he fled the country in February. Next, Houthi rebels have their sights set on the south. Hundreds have now been killed and thousands injured in a conflict that's brought the country to the edge of civil war. These are the headlines, but there's a more complex story to tell. So this week, we're asking, what's the conflict in Yemen really about?
Part 1. The Revolution.
Getting through to people in Yemen has not been easy.
Hello?
Is that Sarah? It's Helena here.
Yeah.
It's great to have you at last. How long's the... After 3 days of trying, we finally get through to our first expert witness, Sarah Jamal, the woman you heard about at the start of this programme. Because of the poor quality of the phone line, her words are read by someone else.
This is not a sectarian conflict.
This is not a sectarian conflict. This is a conflict that is a result of the absence of justice. People right now are not killing each other for the sake of religion.
Before you look at the conflict, she says you have to understand one thing about Yemen. This is not a country riven by sectarian divisions between Shia and Sunni.
I didn't know my sect until 2011.
I didn't know my sect until 2011. Growing up, I played side by side with friends from different backgrounds. We have a unified religion curriculum in schools. We don't have separate schools when it comes to religion. We take the same courses and mosques are side by side.
To understand the conflict, she says you need to go back. Back to the revolution of 2011. Sarah Jamal was one of the revolutionaries.
The
first days of the revolution were what I call the honeymoon, where people came together from different backgrounds, where the educational or the socio-economic background didn't really matter.
At its heart, the revolution was about kicking out President Saleh. Like his counterparts in Egypt and Libya, he'd long outstayed his welcome. After 33 years, people wanted change.
It was a
system that sucked everything out of the country. There were a lot of resources. All of that went to the 1%, to Saleh's family and his allies.
And what was the atmosphere like during those first days of the revolution?
It was beautiful.
It was beautiful. The tribes would come to the square from outside the capital. We would search them for weapons and they would gladly lift their arms and chant for peace. We ate from the same plate. We cried over strangers that were shot. We protected each other and we remained peaceful and loyal to those goals.
The activists got what they wanted. Later that year, President Saleh agreed to step down. But there was a catch.
For 33
years of atrocities, he was rewarded with immunity.
It was here, she says, that things started to unravel. A process of national dialogue began. It was hailed as a model for the region. 500 delegates descended on a 5-star hotel in the capital and spent the next 10 months coming up with a plan for the future. It contained over 1,000 recommendations. But there was a problem. In reality, little changed for two groups in particular, the Houthis in the north and those living in the south.
The national dialogue ignored any practical steps towards transitional justice on the ground. Houthis, meanwhile, changed from a victim, a group that was stripped of basic rights, into an armed militia. The southerners saw nothing on the ground. Their lands were not restored, their jobs were not restored, and the southern movement was never heard.
So to what extent do you think the current conflict is related to disappointment after the revolution?
It's 100%.
It's 100% related. People took to the streets. They had demands. The demands were not met. There was no justice. There was no reconciliation. There's pure revenge now. I was okay with getting killed in 2011 because to me, that was a sacrifice for a better future. But getting killed now would just make me collateral damage.
The seeds of the current conflict were sown in the aftermath of the revolution, she says. The Houthis and those in the south had hoped that the wrongs of the past would be redressed and that they would take a greater share of power in the new Yemen. But they were disappointed, bitterly so. And in the case of the Houthis, that disappointment became a call to arms.
Part 2. The Houthis.
Right now, you have a whole nation living in blockade. There are no food supplies coming into the country, and this is a country that imports 80% of its food. People are afraid.
This is Barash Shaban. He works for the charity Reprieve, where he investigates the impact of drone strikes and secret rendition. It means he's on the road a lot in Yemen, although not right now, because he's stuck in London.
I'm here right now, but I cannot go back because the airports are closed. My family are still in Sana'a. I contact with them almost every day. Every day when the airstrikes starts, it's another day we're just waiting to hear who's next to die. Would that be my friend or my relative?
Barash Shaban's work in Yemen has often taken him to areas that are recovering from conflict, wars waged by President Saleh. These conflicts, he says, are the key to unlocking what's really going on in Yemen today.
It's an accumulation of failed policies, of a 33-year-old dictatorship. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, decided to run a number of conflicts to legitimize his presence in power.
He says it's one war in particular that's led to the conflict today, the war against the Houthis, the northern rebels who are now fighting for control. The group takes its name from its founder, Hussein al-Houthi, a politician and religious scholar who was inspired by the Iranian Revolution and who wanted to eliminate all Western influence in Yemen.
If you read the books of Hussein al-Houthi, he very much focuses on the US invasion of Iraq. And he explains that this is a movement that should stop US occupation on our lands. And this resonates with many of the followers of the movement who believe that there has been many injustices done by the United States and its allies in many Muslim countries.
In 2004, President Saleh accused the Houthis of trying to overthrow the government, and he launched an offensive against them in the north. It was the first of 6 wars.
This created huge grievances amongst the people in those areas who felt that the Yemeni government doesn't care about their grievances, doesn't care if their lives have been destroyed, and are willing to keep this war going forever. And the followers of the Houthi movement today, those are teenagers who back then were like 9, 10 years old, and all what they saw in life was war.
It was only in 2007, when Barash Shaban went to Sada, their stronghold in the north, that he understood the depth of resentment amongst the Houthis. They saw the government as corrupt and dictatorial.
I was shocked by the destruction. The main city of Sada was totally destroyed. And the general vibe amongst the people in Sada were people who felt like They don't want the Yemeni government to exist anymore. They want just for the Yemeni government to leave them alone.
And that's exactly what the government did. It left them to fend for themselves, perfect conditions in which the Houthi movement would flourish.
The Yemeni government didn't have any forces in Sada, leaving it to rule itself. And that's when the Houthi movement stepped in and started to provide security and to provide a basic judiciary for the people. From that moment, things started to change. They started to believe that they can actually control more cities and more provinces, and they can actually get followers, not just from Sada, but from the other provinces going down to the capital.
After the revolution, the group became more ambitious. In the political vacuum that followed, they seized the opportunity, advancing south, eventually taking the capital. But here's the irony. They did this with the help of President Saleh. Yes, that same president who'd fought 6 wars against them. Why? Nothing like a common enemy to bring people together.
The Houthis saw themselves as a new power that can replace the government, and the forces loyal to Saleh wanted to get vengeance on the forces that removed them from power in 2011. And the common enemy was the current president Hadi.
Like our first expert witness, Barar Shaban says this is ultimately a conflict about power and injustice. A conflict in which victims of Yemen's old wars have become the aggressors in the new one.
It's quite interesting that the same group who've been affected by so many wars are the ones who are launching wars now in the south. And I'm almost sure that will create more grievances in the south.
So from the Houthis' stronghold in the north, we're going to head 1,000 kilometres south, where the Houthis are now fighting to take control. We're going here to unravel another key part of the conflict, and it's here that we'll meet our third expert witness.
Part 3. The South.
It shook the house.
It shook the house, it shook the villa. It was very terrifying.
This is Summer Nasser. She's talking about an airstrike that came close to her family's house in the south of Yemen. Because of the poor phone line, we voiced up her interview.
I have siblings who are very young.
I have siblings who are very young who couldn't tolerate it, so I did have to evacuate them to a safer location, just for their sake. It's really emotionally deteriorating for them.
Like our second expert witness, Summer Nasser is stuck. Not in London, but Yemen. As you might guess from her name, Summer Nasser is Yemeni American. She should be back at university in New York, studying sociology. Instead, she's dodging bullets in Yemen.
It's just the street wars.
It's the street wars that are more terrifying. You have tanks that are shooting randomly in the city itself, and you have shooting between the people who are anti-army, anti-Houthi, and there are Houthi fighters attacking them.
Now that the Houthis have control of the capital, they're fighting for the south, the new heart of the conflict. But the south has its own story, one that makes the conflict more intractable. It starts in 1990, when Yemen was 2 separate countries, the richer, capitalist north and the Marxist, more secular south, countries with very different cultures and traditions. In May that year, those countries were unified.
Actually, Southerners were
very, very happy about this, and they felt it was a step to develop the country on both ends.
But it soon became clear that the South wasn't going to get what it wanted, its fair share of power in the new unified government led by President Saleh. After 4 years, civil war broke out. But it was what happened after the war that led to the long-lasting resentment still felt in the South today.
land, homes were being taken.
Land and homes were being taken, not a small amount of land. Southern people that were posted in the military ended up being dropped out of the military to give positions to the Northerners.
Anger about stolen land and being locked out of government led to the creation of a new movement. But it wasn't just about power. It was about identity too.
In 2007, the Southern movement...
In 2007, the Southern movement was officially created. The Southerners did not call for separation. They actually called for attention to the Southern case. After a few years that didn't happen. They felt fed up, and that's when independence calls really pushed forward after 2007.
And in 2012, that same post-revolution plan we heard about earlier that failed the Houthis also failed the South.
After it failed,
they ended up going back to the squares. They did civil disobedience, constant protests, almost daily. They looked at it as another failure, and that's why they ended up pushing more for separation.
Now, threatened with occupation by the Houthis, with very different traditions to their own, Southerners are fighting back. But they're not just fighting the Houthis, they're also fighting their old enemy, President Saleh. It's becoming a battle for the survival of the South. Do you think that the current conflict can be resolved without addressing grievances in the South?
No, absolutely not.
So in Yemen now, you have one group with a history of injustice fighting another. But while the majority of the South are Sunni, fighting the Shia Houthis, Summer, like our other expert witnesses, says this is not a sectarian conflict.
People
are saying in the media that it's a sectarian conflict. Yemenis do not believe that. It's not sectarian whatsoever. We have lived together, Shias and Houthis, Zaydis, for years, and we have lived with them peacefully for years. It's about power and greed.
But this internal power struggle is only one layer of the conflict. In the last few months, another layer has formed on top, one which could change the nature of the fighting and the country. Stick with us. It's about to get a little more complicated.
Part 4. The Outsiders.
Yemen seems to be poised for a protracted period of conflict inside the country.
This is April Longley Ali. She's the senior Arabia Peninsula analyst for the International Crisis Group, and she's based in Dubai. She's been travelling back and forth to Yemen for the past 11 years.
There is the internal Yemeni power struggle, and now increasingly there is the regional angle, the regional struggle that is being overlaid on top.
That struggle is the ongoing rivalry between the two regional powerhouses, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Yemen has become its new battleground.
Saudi Arabia is playing a pivotal role at the moment. Again, Yemen is in Saudi's backyard. So from the Saudis' perspective, when they look at Yemen, they are convinced that the Houthis in particular are an Iranian proxy. So as the Houthis expanded rapidly militarily, this was perceived as a direct threat to Saudi Arabia.
For the last month, Saudi Arabia has been bombing Houthi targets. And it's not just the Saudis who see the hidden hand of Iran in all of this. The US does too. But is there any evidence of Iranian support for the Houthis?
The Houthis are a Yemeni movement. They have expressed respect for the Iranian regime. They clearly have political ties with the Iranian regime and moral support. There seems to be some degree of financial support, possibly military training. But what we're seeing now, however, appears to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Houthis have taken extremely inflammatory actions to stoke those fears that there is this very strong connection between the two. And as the Saudis become more involved in Yemen, it's being pulled into the regional conflict between Saudi and Iran, which is a dynamic, again, that is only going to complicate and prolong conflict inside of Yemen itself.
From what you're saying, it seems that it's not just what regional powers are doing in Yemen, it's how groups within Yemen are then responding to that involvement.
Absolutely. At its core, this is a political power struggle inside of Yemen. But over time, various actors inside of Yemen have certainly opened their country up to inviting in this regional power struggle inside of the country. I think that the most important point to for your listeners is that this is a conflict inside of Yemen in which no one group is going to come out as a clear military victor. It really must be a political compromise, or, we're in for a very long and protracted period of violence.
In this inquiry, we've heard that the conflict is ultimately about power. Our expert witnesses have all been at pains to point out that it's not about sectarianism. But now, with the involvement of Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran, the fear is that could change.
Unfortunately, already the conflict is taking on a sectarian dimension. Already, with the addition of regional players, this is stoking a sectarian narrative, sectarian language that is mostly foreign to Yemen. But what we're seeing right now is that the fabric of Yemeni society and those bonds that have held these groups together, they're being pulled apart.
And, as if things couldn't get any worse, Al-Qaeda, the great opportunists, are stepping in and exploiting religious differences.
My fear is it's easy to ignite the sectarian conflict and frame this as a war that is happening based on sectarian grounds.
So what's the conflict in Yemen really all about? Power. Power that for decades has been confined to a small circle of elites close to the old president. Now there's a vacuum. The Houthi rebels are trying to take control, resulting in those in the south having to fight to defend their homeland and traditions once again, fueling an already strong separatist movement. For those outside Yemen, the most worrying part is the prospect of a resurgent Al-Qaeda finding new recruits amid the chaos. But for those inside the country, perhaps the greater fear is that this conflict could change the nature of Yemen itself. From a country where Shia and Sunni once prayed side by side, to one riven by sectarian divides.
This inquiry was presented by Helena Merriman and produced in London by me, James Fletcher, Phoebe Keane and Charlotte Pritchard. The editor is Richard Knight. Since we recorded the interview with Sarah Jamal, she's tweeted that it's now 7 days without power in Sana'a. Sarah's words were read by our colleague May Noman, who's just completed an interactive Idiot's Guide to Yemen video, which you can find on the Explainers section of the BBC website. And with news of more boats sinking and more lives lost in the Mediterranean, you might also be interested in our programme asking, could Europe stop migrants dying in the Med? And if you want to demand an inquiry, get in touch on the BBC World Service Facebook page or on Twitter. We're at BBC The Inquiry.